The Galactic Council chamber fell silent when Ambassador Valkyra of the Zenthari Empire made her declaration. Humans, she announced with barely concealed disgust, were nothing more than primitive creatures who had stumbled into space travel through blind luck. Her species had conquered 40 star systems and ruled over 100 billion souls. What could these newcomers possibly offer to the grand tapestry of civilization? Standing in the visitor section was Captain Amy Morrison of Earth's first deep space vessel. She wore the standard blue uniform of the Terran Space Initiative, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Amy had expected this kind of reception. Every report from the scout ships had warned that the older species saw humanity as little more than curious animals who had learned to use tools. The Zenthari ambassador continued her speech. She proposed that humans be classified as a Category 3 species, which meant they would need permission from the Council before colonizing any world or establishing trade routes. It was the diplomatic equivalent of being put in a playpen. Amy felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her expression neutral. The Council representatives from various species nodded along. The insectoid Krevesh clicked their mandibles in agreement. The crystalline lumens chimed their approval. Even the usually fair Dorian delegates seemed to accept this assessment without question. When Valkyra finished her proposal, the council chair asked if anyone wished to speak in opposition. Amy raised her hand. The chair looked surprised but nodded for her to approach the speaking platform. As Amy walked down the central aisle, she could feel hundreds of alien eyes upon her. Some gazes held curiosity while others showed only contempt. She reached the platform and adjusted the translation device on her collar. "Good morning, honored council members," she began. "My name is Amy Morrison, and I captain the exploration vessel Wanderer. I come before you today to contest the proposed classification." Ambassador Valkyra's crest flared in irritation. "This is not a debate floor, human," she said sharply. "The council has heard your species' introduction and found it wanting. Perhaps in another century, when you have matured, you may petition again." Amy smiled politely with respect. "Ambassador, I was not asking for permission to speak. The council chair granted me that right. I simply wish to present information that may have been overlooked." The chair gestured for her to continue, though he looked uncertain. Amy took a breath. "You judge us by your own standards," she said. "You look at our technology and find it basic. You examine our territorial holdings and find them small. You review our history and see endless conflict. All of this is true. We do not deny it. But you are measuring us by metrics that do not capture what makes humanity unique." A Dorian delegate spoke up. "And what makes you unique, child species?" she asked. Not unkindly. "Every race believes itself special." Amy nodded fair. "Point, let me tell you a story then. Before we had spacecraft, before we even had computers, there was a time when humans were divided into many nations. These nations fought terrible wars. During one such war, a massive conflict that engulfed our entire planet, a young woman named Lisa lived in a city that was under constant bombardment. The alien audience seemed unmoved. War is universal. One of the Krevesh clicked. "This proves nothing. Please let me finish." Amy said Lisa worked in a hospital every day. She saw the wounded and dying. Resources were scarce. Medicine was rationed. Food was limited. One evening a soldier was brought in. He was from the enemy nation. He was dying. Lisa had just enough medicine to save one person. In her ward was also a child from her own nation who needed that same medicine. The council chamber was quiet now. Lisa gave the medicine to the enemy soldier. She continued. When asked why, she said something that became famous in our history. She said that suffering has no nationality, and that healing knows no borders. The soldier survived. 60 years later, his granddaughter would develop a cure for a disease that had plagued humanity for centuries. Valkyra scoffed. "A pretty tale. But anecdotes are not policy. One person's kindness does not represent a species." Amy smiled again. "You are absolutely right, Ambassador. One story proves nothing. So let me tell you about Project Nightlight." The council members leaned forward slightly. "When humans first developed radio technology, we began sending signals into space. For decades we heard nothing back. Most species would have stopped. Why waste resources shouting into an empty void? But a woman named Beth Rodriguez had a different idea. She convinced our governments to build a massive array of satellites, not to broadcast but to listen. She said that perhaps we were using the wrong frequency or the wrong mathematical language. For 30 years, Beth and her team listened. She died before we made first contact, when we finally received a signal. From the Dorian Republic, the first words decoded were instructions for a distress beacon. A colony ship of yours was stranded in the outer reaches of our solar system. Because Beth never gave up, we were able to rescue 412 Dorian colonists. The Dorian delegate who had spoken earlier stood abruptly. The lost colony of New Haven, she whispered. We thought them dead. Those colonists returned to us 3 years ago, thanks to human intervention. Amy nodded. Beth Rodriguez never lived to see them rescued. She spent her entire life listening to static because she believed that connection was more important than silence. That is what humans do, Ambassador Valkyra. We persist when logic says to quit. We hope when evidence says to despair. We reach out when wisdom says to withdraw. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Valkyra's crest had lowered slightly. These stories are moving, the ambassador admitted, but they still do not demonstrate the kind of technological or military capability that defines a category 1 or 2 species. Amy felt something shift in her chest. With respect, Ambassador, I think that is exactly my point. You define advancement by weapons and territory. Humans define it by bridges and breakthroughs. Every species here has conquered. We are the first species in Council history to arrive, having chosen peace over expansion. Valkyra laughed, but it sounded uncertain. You chose peace because you lacked the ability to conquer. Amy shook her head. We had the ability. Ambassador, we built weapons that could shatter our own world. We developed biological agents that could wipe out entire populations. We created artificial intelligence that could have replaced us entirely. And then we chose to dismantle most of them. We chose to redirect those resources toward exploration and medicine. That was not weakness. That was the hardest choice our species ever made. A new voice spoke, from the council. It was one of the Lumen delegates whose crystalline form pulsed with soft light. You say you dismantled these weapons, the Lumen chimed, but you still possess the knowledge to recreate them. Does this not make you dangerous? Amy met the Lumen's gaze. It makes us survivors. Every species in this chamber has faced extinction events. The difference is that our greatest threat was ourselves. We learned to recognize our own destructive patterns and chose to change them. That kind of transformation is not easy. It took generations. It required sacrifices that broke our hearts, but we did it because we decided that our legacy should be creation, not destruction. The council chair spoke for the first time since Amy began. These are fine words, Captain Morrison, but the council must make decisions based on assessment, not inspiration. What tangible evidence can you provide that humanity deserves a higher classification? Amy had been waiting for this question. She pulled a data chip from her pocket and held it up. This contains the complete records of the Terran medical database. She said it includes treatments and cures for over 3,000 diseases, many of which affect multiple species in this council. We are offering this freely to the galactic community. No trade agreements required, no territorial concessions demanded. We give this because we believe that healing should be a right, not a privilege. The chamber erupted in discussion. Several delegates began speaking at once. The council chair called for order. Valkyra's crest was now fully lowered, a sign of confusion among her people. This is unprecedented, she said quietly. No species has ever offered such valuable information without demanding something in return. What is your price? Human. Amy smiled sadly. The price, Ambassador, is that you remember we offered it. When you write your histories of this era, I want you to note that humans came to the galactic stage not with threats but with gifts. I want you to remember that we extended our hands before we drew our weapons. And most importantly, I want you to acknowledge that strength is not measured only in firepower. The council deliberated for 3 hours. Amy was asked to wait in an antechamber. She sat alone, reviewing the speech in her mind and wondering if she had done enough. Finally, she was called back. The council chair stood. After careful consideration and debate, he announced, "We have decided to grant humanity a Category 2 classification with a provision for review in 5 years. Furthermore, we are accepting your gift of medical knowledge with gratitude. Several council members wish to establish cultural exchange programs with Earth." The council session is adjourned. Amy felt her knees weaken with relief. As the delegates filed out, several approached her. The Dorian delegate clasped her hand in the human fashion. "My cousin was on that colony ship," she said softly. "Thank you for bringing her home." Other delegates offered similar words of appreciation or respect. Even some of the Kravesh, who had seemed hostile earlier, nodded acknowledgement as they passed. Only Valkyra remained distant as Amy prepared to leave. The ambassador approached her. "You spoke well today," human Valkyra said. Her tone was no longer contemptuous but thoughtful. "Perhaps I have been measuring strength by the Ron."